the most disturbing alien encounters ever recorded. In the pitch-black silence of the forest, James trembled as he pressed his flashlight against the frost-covered ground. The beam flickered, and in its pale light something moved. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. A glistening silver hand stretched out of the darkness, impossibly long fingers curling toward him. Then the sound, a low, wet clicking that seemed to come from inside his own skull. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone. James had always loved the isolation of the wilderness. Growing up in a bustling suburb where the constant hum of streetlights and car engines drowned out the night, he found the deep silence of nature comforting. So when his friends suggested a weekend camping trip in Whitehaven National Forest, he eagerly agreed. They packed their gear, double-checked the maps, and headed into the heart of the forest, miles away from the nearest trailhead. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and pine. For 2 days they hiked deeper and deeper, past landmarks few had ever seen. By the time they set up their second camp, James felt more at peace than he had in years. That first night was like any other. The campfire flickered warmly, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Laughter echoed through the clearing as they swapped stories and roasted marshmallows. When the fire began to die down, they crawled into their tents, the crackling embers lulling them to sleep. But the second night was different. The change was subtle at first, a gradual drop in temperature that made the air feel heavy. The sounds of the forest faded, one by one. No chirping insects, no distant hoots of owls. The silence crept in like a predator, suffocating and unnatural. James stirred in his sleeping bag, unease gnawing at his thoughts. He reached for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the pitch-black darkness. The faint rustle of leaves drew his attention, but when he aimed the light, nothing was there. Probably just the wind, he muttered to himself, though the trees stood deathly still. As he lay back down, he noticed it, a faint light, barely visible through the fabric of his tent. At first, he thought it was the moon, but the glow was wrong. It pulsed, like a heartbeat. He unzipped the tent cautiously, stepping into the cold night. His breath formed clouds in the air as he scanned the tree line. There it was again, a small, hovering orb, no larger than a tennis ball. It moved erratically, darting between the trees like it was alive. "Guys, you need to see this," he called, but his voice sounded swallowed by the silence. The others emerged groggily, their flashlights piercing the darkness. "What is that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. No one answered. The orb flickered, its light intensifying. It grew brighter and brighter until James had to shield his eyes. Then, without warning, it blinked out, plunging them into complete darkness. A heavy stillness settled over the group, their breaths shallow and synchronized. The forest, once an inviting refuge, now felt alien. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Let's go back to the tents," Mike said, his voice tight with fear. They retreated, but the unease lingered. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Lying in his tent, he strained to hear anything. Footsteps, whispers, even the wind. But all he heard was his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with distorted images. Blurred faces stared at him from the darkness, their mouths moving silently. A high-pitched ringing filled his head, growing louder until he woke with a start. His flashlight was dead. The campfire, too. Only the faint glow of the stars remained, but even they seemed dimmer, swallowed by an encroaching blackness. Morning brought no relief. The group sat around the fire pit, their faces pale and drawn. "Did anyone else hear something last night?" Claire asked hesitantly. "Something?" Mike scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Like what?" "Voices," she said, her eyes darting toward the trees. "I heard whispering, but it wasn't in English. It didn't even sound human." James nodded slowly. "I didn't hear whispers, but there was something out there. I don't know how to describe it. It felt wrong, like it shouldn't exist." Mike shook his head. "We're just scaring ourselves. It was probably an animal." James didn't argue. But deep down, he knew Mike was wrong. The light, the silence, the oppressive atmosphere, it all felt orchestrated, deliberate. As they packed up their gear and prepared to move to a new site, James caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt. It was gone in an instant, but it left a chill in his bones. The day passed uneventfully, though the group's mood remained somber. They hiked in silence, their usual banter replaced by nervous glances over their shoulders. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing denser and the air thicker. By the time they set up camp again, the unease had settled into a quiet dread. As night fell, James sat by the fire, staring into the flames. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He didn't know what, but it was close. And it was watching. The campfire had always been their anchor in the wilderness, a small, comforting reminder of civilization amidst the untamed chaos of the forest. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on their third night, even the crackling flames couldn't drive away the oppressive weight that hung in the air. James poked at the embers absent-mindedly, his thoughts circling back to the orb they had seen the night before. Its movements, unnatural and erratic, played in his mind like a reel on repeat. The questions it raised had no answers. What was it? Where had it gone? And why did its presence feel so wrong? The others weren't faring much better. Claire sat with her knees hugged to her chest, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Her usual cheerful demeanor was gone, replaced by an unnerving vacancy in her eyes. She hadn't spoken much since the morning, only offering terse one-word responses. Mike, ever the skeptic, seemed to be unraveling as well. His normally confident posture was slouched, and his hand never strayed far from the hunting knife strapped to his belt. Every snapping twig, every faint rustle of leaves sent his eyes darting to the tree line. "It's too quiet," Claire whispered suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely audible, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "What do you mean?" James asked, though he already knew. "No birds, no insects, and nothing. It's like the whole forest just stopped." Her voice quivered, and she shivered as if the cold had seeped into her very bones. Mike scoffed, though his laugh sounded forced. "Maybe they know we're here and decided to keep it down for the night." Nobody laughed. The absence of sound wasn't just unsettling, it was suffocating. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. As the night wore on, the paranoia began to take root. Small things started to happen, things they couldn't explain. Claire's flashlight flickered, though she had just replaced the batteries. Their tents seemed colder than they should have been, even with their sleeping bags. And then there was the hum, a low, barely perceptible vibration that seemed to come from the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't loud enough to be heard outright, but they could feel it, buzzing faintly in their bones like a tuning fork pressed against their skulls. "What the hell is that?" Mike muttered, his voice tight with unease. He crouched down, pressing his palm against the earth. "Do you feel that? It's like it's alive." James nodded, though he didn't want to believe it. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe an underground spring or distant machinery. But deep down, he knew better. The forest wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel aware. Claire suddenly stood, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I need to go. I can't stay here," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "Go where?" James asked, rising to his feet. "Anywhere but here," she snapped, her breathing shallow and rapid. "I can't take this silence, this whatever the hell is out there." "Claire, calm down," James said, trying to steady her. But as he reached for her arm, she recoiled violently, her eyes wide with terror. "Don't touch me," she screamed, backing away. Her voice echoed unnaturally in the stillness, as though the forest itself was amplifying her panic. Before James could respond, a sound shattered the silence. A high-pitched metallic screech that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was sharp, piercing, like nails on a chalkboard amplified 1,000-fold. They all froze, their bodies rigid with fear. The sound cut through them like a blade, leaving a ringing in their ears long after it stopped. What the hell was that? Mike whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. James scanned the darkness, his flashlight trembling in his hand. I don't know, he admitted, though the words felt hollow. The truth was, he didn't want to know. The forest had changed. The once familiar shapes of the trees now seemed foreign, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. Shadows shifted and stretched, forming shapes that dissolved the moment he tried to focus on them. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. They were miles from the nearest road, and even if they could navigate the treacherous terrain in the dark, something told him they wouldn't make it far. The hum returned, louder this time, vibrating through the ground and up into their bodies. Claire dropped to her knees, clutching her head as though trying to block out a noise only she could hear. "It's inside my head," she whimpered, her voice broken and desperate. "Make it stop." James crouched beside her, his own fear pushed aside by the need to help her. "Claire, listen to me. We're going to be okay. We just need to stay calm." But his words felt empty, even to him. How could they stay calm when everything around them screamed danger? Mike, his patience fraying, gripped his knife tighter. "We need to get out of here. Now," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained panic. "And go where?" James shot back. "We don't even know what's out there." As if in response, another sound filled the air, a low, guttural clicking like the chittering of insects magnified and distorted. It came from the trees, then the ground, then the air around them. It was everywhere, closing in. James felt his throat tighten as a cold sweat broke out across his skin. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The fire, their last source of comfort, suddenly snuffed out, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the pitch black, the clicking grew louder, more frantic. And in that moment, James realized the truth. They weren't alone. Something was out there, watching them, stalking them, and it was getting closer. James woke with a start, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. His sleeping bag felt damp with sweat, and his heart pounded as though he had been running for miles. At first, he thought it was just another nightmare, one of the many fragmented terrors that had plagued his sleep since the light appeared. But as he sat up and strained to listen, he realized the forest was alive with an unnatural energy. It wasn't sound in the conventional sense, it was vibration, an insistent, pulsing thrum that resonated in his bones. He pressed his hands against the ground, feeling the rhythmic tremor coursing through the earth beneath him. Fumbling for his flashlight, he unzipped the tent with trembling hands. The moment the zipper parted, a strange metallic tang filled his nostrils, sharp and acrid like burnt wire. The campfire, once their sanctuary, was extinguished, leaving behind a pit of smoldering ash. He scanned the clearing, his flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. The tents of his friends were still zipped shut, silent and undisturbed. But something was off. The trees that surrounded their camp, massive towering pines that had stood for centuries, seemed closer than before, their gnarled branches twisting toward the center like skeletal arms. "Mike, Claire," James called, his voice cracking. The sound didn't carry. Instead, it felt swallowed by the night, as though the forest itself refused to let it escape. He crept toward Mike's tent, his footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. Reaching out, he tapped the fabric. "Mike, are you awake?" The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. Then, from within the tent, a low, guttural groan. It wasn't a sound James recognized, not pain, not frustration. It was something primal, almost animalistic. He stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Mike, what's going on?" The zipper of the tent moved, agonizingly slow, and James froze as a figure emerged. But it wasn't Mike, or at least not entirely. His friend's face was slack, his eyes wide but unseeing, reflecting the beam of the flashlight like a predator caught in headlights. His skin had an unnatural sheen, as though coated in a thin layer of perspiration, but his lips were cracked and dry, bloodied from where they had been chewed raw. "James?" Mike's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and fragmented, as if dragged from the depths of his throat. "They're here." "Who's here?" James demanded, but Mike didn't respond. His head tilted unnaturally to the side, his gaze fixed on the tree line. Without another word, he began walking, his movements stiff and mechanical, as though guided by invisible strings. Panic surged through James. "Mike, stop. Where are you going?" He reached out to grab his friend's arm, but the moment his fingers made contact, Mike recoiled violently, a strangled cry erupting from his lips. His entire body convulsed, and he collapsed to the ground, writhing in the dirt. "James," Mike croaked again, his voice now layered with an otherworldly resonance, as though another voice spoke in unison with his. "They're watching. They're always watching." Before James could react, a new sound pierced the air. The clicking. It was faint at first, like the ticking of a distant clock, but it grew louder, sharper, more deliberate. It came from everywhere at once, the trees, the ground, even the air itself. The clicking seemed to synchronize with the vibrations beneath James's feet, creating a suffocating rhythm that filled every corner of his mind. He stumbled backward, his flashlight beam darting frantically across the clearing. That's when he saw them. Pale, elongated figures, their forms barely visible against the darkness. They stood just beyond the reach of the light, their bodies unnaturally thin, their limbs impossibly long. They didn't move like humans. Their heads tilted sharply as though studying him, their movements sudden and disjointed like a marionette's. "Mike, get up," James shouted, but his friend remained on the ground, his body twitching sporadically. The figures began to move, gliding silently toward the camp. James could feel their presence like a physical weight pressing down on him, their gaze piercing even though he couldn't see their eyes. He turned to Claire's tent, desperation driving his actions. "Claire, wake up!" He yanked the zipper open, only to find the tent empty. Her sleeping bag was still neatly laid out, untouched. Panic clawed at his chest. Where had she gone? The clicking grew louder, closer, accompanied by a faint, pulsating glow that seemed to emanate from the figures themselves. James backed away, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest closed in around him, the trees twisting and bending as though alive. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, their shapes shifting and writhing like smoke. Then, one of the figures stepped fully into the beam of his flashlight. Its skin was smooth and reflective, like polished metal, and its face, or what should have been a face, was a blank expanse, featureless save for two deep sunken voids where eyes should be. It raised a hand, its fingers unnaturally long and jointless, and pointed directly at him. James felt a sharp pain spike through his skull, a piercing electric sensation that brought him to his knees. The light from his flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to mock his terror. He clutched his head, the clicking now inside his mind, growing louder with each passing second. Through the haze of pain, he heard it, a voice, cold and emotionless, yet deafening in its intensity. "You were chosen." The words didn't come from the figure, nor from the forest. They came from within, a telepathic intrusion that left him trembling. James managed to lift his head, his vision blurred by tears. The figures surrounded him now, their movements synchronized, their forms shifting in and out of focus, as though they weren't entirely bound to this reality. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The figures vanished, the clicking ceased, and the forest fell silent once more. James collapsed to the ground, his body trembling uncontrollably. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. But the words lingered, etched into his mind like a brand. "You were chosen." When James came to, the world felt different, wrong, as though it had been subtly altered while he lay unconscious. The air was heavy with an oppressive stillness, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. His limbs were sluggish, weighed down by an inexplicable fatigue that seemed to seep into his very bones. As he sat up, the forest around him came into focus, but it wasn't the forest he remembered. The trees were impossibly tall now, their trunks twisted into unnatural spirals that seemed to writhe when viewed too closely. The ground was no longer solid earth, but a shimmering surface that pulsed faintly, as if alive. "Mike, Claire." His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. The words felt hollow, swallowed by the suffocating quiet. There was no response, only the low, thrumming vibration beneath him, a sinister heartbeat that resonated in his chest. James forced himself to his feet, every movement a monumental effort. His flashlight was gone, leaving him in near total darkness, save for the faint phosphorescent glow emanating from the ground. He scanned the clearing, but it was empty. Mike's tent was gone, along with Claire's. The fire pit was a perfect circle of ash, as though the flames had been extinguished with surgical precision. And then he heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, like a radio transmission from another dimension. It came from the forest, echoing between the trees. "James." The sound was layered, one voice overlapping another, creating an eerie, discordant harmony. It wasn't just calling his name, it was beckoning him, pulling him forward with an invisible force. "Who's there?" James shouted, his voice trembling. He took a hesitant step toward the sound, the glowing ground rippling beneath his feet. The voice didn't respond, but the thrumming grew louder, almost insistent, like the ticking of an unseen clock counting down. As he moved deeper into the forest, the environment around him seemed to shift and warp. The trees stretched impossibly high, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so dense it blocked out even the faintest starlight. The air grew colder, biting at his skin despite the sweat that dripped from his brow. Shapes flickered at the edges of his vision, slender, elongated figures that melted into the shadows the moment he turned to look. The voice called again, louder this time, its tone both urgent and malevolent. "James." It came from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding him, pressing against his mind like a physical weight. He clutched his head, trying to block it out, but the sound burrowed deeper, invading his thoughts. "Stop it!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Leave me alone!" But the voices only grew stronger, multiplying until they became a cacophony of whispers, each one speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The words were alien, yet they resonated with a primal fear that bypassed logic and burrowed straight into his soul. His knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, gasping for air as the whispers coalesced into a single deafening command. "Come closer!" James tried to resist, but his body betrayed him, rising of its own accord. His legs moved mechanically, carrying him forward against his will. The forest opened up into a clearing, and in the center stood a structure that defied comprehension. It was a monolith, impossibly tall and made of a material that seemed to shift and shimmer like liquid mercury. Its surface was covered in symbols, intricate angular markings that pulsed with an otherworldly light. The voices were louder now, emanating from the monolith itself. They weren't speaking words anymore, but thoughts, raw and unfiltered, pouring directly into his mind. Images flashed before his eyes, a vast, infinite void filled with spiraling galaxies, shadowy figures standing in circles, their hands raised in supplication, and a single, blinding light that consumed everything in its path. James stumbled toward the monolith, unable to stop himself. As he drew closer, the ground beneath his feet began to dissolve, replaced by a swirling, viscous substance that clung to his shoes. The air grew thick, almost liquid, making it difficult to breathe. His vision blurred, and his thoughts fragmented, each one replaced by the same overwhelming phrase, "You are chosen." Reaching the base of the monolith, James placed a trembling hand against its surface. The moment his skin made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him, electrifying and paralyzing all at once. His mind was no longer his own. It was an open book, each page being flipped and examined by an unseen force. He saw his memories laid bare, Childhood laughter, the warmth of his mother's embrace the first time he felt the sting of loss. But the Force wasn't interested in these. It delved deeper, seeking something primal, something buried. And then it found it. Fear. It pulled at the threads of his terror, unraveling them until they consumed him. He saw visions of his friends, their bodies twisted and contorted into grotesque forms. He saw the pale, elongated figures standing over him, their eyeless faces void of emotion. He saw the light again, blinding and all-encompassing, and understood with horrifying clarity that it wasn't salvation, it was annihilation. The monolith pulsed, and James was thrown backward, landing hard on the ground. He gasped for air, his chest heaving as the voices finally receded. The forest was silent again, but the damage was done. He could feel it in his mind, a fragment of something alien that had taken root, growing and spreading like a parasite. He looked up at the monolith, and for the first time he noticed the figures standing around it. They were human, or at least they had been once. Their bodies were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over their bones. Their eyes were wide and unblinking, their mouths slightly agape as if caught mid-scream. They stood motionless, their arms raised toward the monolith in silent worship. James scrambled to his feet, his instincts screaming at him to run. But as he turned to flee, he saw them, more figures emerging from the trees. They were everywhere now, their pale forms blending seamlessly with the darkness. They didn't move toward him, but their presence was suffocating, a wall of eyes, if they even had eyes, that bore into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He took a step back, his foot sinking into the viscous ground. The monolith pulsed again, and the voices returned, this time softer, almost soothing. "There is no escape," they whispered. "You belong to us now." James ran. He didn't know where he was going, or if he could ever escape, but he ran, his heart pounding and his mind racing. The forest blurred around him, the trees twisting and contorting as if mocking his desperation. And behind him, the figures followed, silent and relentless, their presence a constant reminder that he would never truly be free. James ran until his legs burned and his lungs felt like they might collapse. The air was thick, suffused with the acrid tang of electricity, and each breath felt like he was inhaling liquid metal. The forest around him warped and shifted, the trees twisting into grotesque, otherworldly shapes. Their branches stretched unnaturally, some bending downward, like clawed hands reaching for him. Shadows slithered along the ground, their forms indistinct but undeniably alive, darting just out of sight. He could hear them behind him, the silent watchers, their presence more palpable than any sound. They didn't move with footsteps or rustling leaves. Instead, their approach was heralded by the oppressive weight of their gaze, an invisible force that pressed against his back, urging him to stop and surrender. The forest itself seemed complicit in their pursuit. The ground grew uneven, roots erupting like grasping fingers to trip him, while the trees leaned in closer, narrowing the path until it felt like he was being funneled toward some inevitable doom. "Please, just leave me alone," James panted, his voice cracking under the strain of desperation. But the forest offered no reply, only the omnipresent hum that had become an ever-present part of his reality. It vibrated in his chest, a low, unrelenting frequency that seemed to sync with his heartbeat, driving him toward the brink of madness. The glow returned, faint at first but growing steadily brighter as he pushed forward. It wasn't the warm, golden light of salvation. It was cold, sterile, and unnaturally sharp, casting harsh shadows that danced unnervingly across the warped landscape. The glow emanated from a clearing ahead, and James's instincts screamed for him to turn back, to run in the opposite direction. But his body betrayed him once more, drawn toward the light as if some unseen force had taken control of his will. As he stumbled into the clearing, the full horror of his situation became clear. The monolith from before stood at the center, towering over the landscape like a malevolent sentinel. Its surface shimmered with an otherworldly energy, the symbols etched into it pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to match the thrumming in his chest. But this time, It wasn't alone. Surrounding the monolith were dozens of figures, human, or what remained of them. They were lined up in concentric circles, their bodies emaciated and their skin translucent, revealing a network of black veins pulsing with a sickly, luminous fluid. Their faces were frozen in expressions of anguish, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. Their eyes, or the hollow sockets where eyes once were, glowed faintly, mirroring the monolith's eerie light. James's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat as the full weight of the scene hit him. These weren't just victims. They were offerings, sacrifices to whatever unholy force the monolith represented. And now he was here, drawn into their ritual. The voices returned, louder than ever, filling the air with a deafening cacophony of whispers and screams. They spoke in unison, their alien language vibrating through his skull, making it feel as though his head might split open. But amidst the chaos, one phrase repeated itself, clearer and more insistent than the rest. "You must see." Before he could react, the ground beneath him shifted. It wasn't solid anymore. It rippled and undulated like a living thing. He stumbled and fell to his knees, his hands sinking into the viscous, glowing surface. The light from the monolith grew blinding, and the voices reached a crescendo, their command now undeniable. "Look!" James's head was wrenched upward by an unseen force, his eyes locking onto the monolith. The symbols began to shift and change, rearranging themselves into patterns that defied logic and comprehension. They weren't just markings, they were alive, writhing and pulsating as though imbued with a malevolent intelligence. And then, the visions began. His mind was no longer his own, it was a canvas upon which the monolith painted its truths. He saw worlds beyond imagining, planets bathed in perpetual darkness, their skies filled with swirling, malevolent storms. He saw towering structures that defied physics, built by beings whose forms shifted and twisted like smoke. He saw endless voids, teeming with life, yet utterly devoid of warmth or hope. But it wasn't just what he saw, it was what he felt. Each vision carried with it a profound sense of dread, a realization that humanity was insignificant in the grand tapestry of existence. These beings, these watchers, weren't here to invade or conquer. They didn't need to. They were beyond such petty concepts. They existed on a level so far removed from human understanding that their mere presence was enough to unravel reality. James screamed, his voice raw and guttural, but the visions didn't stop. They intensified, driving deeper into his psyche, peeling back the layers of his mind until nothing was left but raw, unfiltered terror. He saw himself, not as a person, but as a speck of dust in an infinite cosmos, utterly powerless and inconsequential. The monolith pulsed one final time, and James felt a surge of energy course through him, an overwhelming wave that blurred the line between pain and ecstasy. His vision went white, and for a moment, he was nothing. No body, no mind, just a fragment of thought adrift in the void. When he awoke, he was back in the forest, lying on the cold, damp ground. The monolith was gone, and the clearing was empty. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, he thought he might have imagined it all. But then he saw the mark. It was on his forearm, a faint but unmistakable symbol etched into his skin. It pulsed faintly, the same rhythm as the monolith. He could still hear the voices, faint and distant, whispering in the back of his mind. James staggered to his feet, his body weak and trembling. The forest was still, but he knew it wasn't over. The Watchers were still out there, and now they had marked him. He was a part of their ritual, a pawn in their incomprehensible game. As he stumbled through the forest, one thought consumed him. This wasn't just happening to him. The Watchers weren't confined to this place. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. And soon, the world would see what he had seen. The light was coming. James stumbled forward, his body weak and trembling, each step feeling heavier than the last. The forest around him had grown utterly alien. Twisted trees with translucent bark pulsed faintly as if alive, and the ground beneath his feet no longer felt solid. It gave slightly under his weight, like flesh stretched too thin. The whispers in his mind swelled into an overwhelming cacophony, voices colliding, each screaming a different truth. He couldn't distinguish if they were inside him or echoing from the mark on his forearm flared, searing with a heat that made his vision blur. He clawed at it in vain, but the pain only deepened, reaching into the marrow of his bones. And then, just ahead, the glow returned. Not the faint, distant shimmer from before, but an all-encompassing radiance. It poured through the trees, turning the warped forest into an endless sea of stark white. James shielded his eyes, but the light burned through his lids, flooding his vision until there was nothing but brightness. "Stop, please," he screamed, though the words felt meaningless in the face of what was coming. His voice was swallowed by the hum, now resonating in his skull, vibrating through his teeth. The light was alive. It had weight, intent, and a presence that pressed against his chest like an immense unseen hand. The ground fell away, and James was suspended in the void. There was no up, no down, only the light and the vast, unknowable thing it heralded. And then, he saw it. At first it was a ripple in the light, like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. But the ripple grew, unfurling into something incomprehensible. It wasn't a shape or a creature. It was an awareness, a presence that existed outside the bounds of human understanding. Its form shifted endlessly, cycling through geometries that seemed impossible, its edges bleeding into dimensions James couldn't comprehend. The whispers coalesced into a singular voice, deep and resonant, carrying the weight of eternity. It spoke not in words but in ideas, each one slamming into James's mind with the force of a tidal wave. "You have been chosen. Through you, the light will spread." James screamed as the mark on his arm began to glow brighter, lines of light spreading across his veins like fire coursing through his blood. He tried to fight it, clawing at his skin, but the light only grew, consuming him from the inside out. His thoughts unraveled, memories dissolving into fragments, leaving him raw and exposed. The entity revealed its purpose. It wasn't here to destroy. It didn't need to. Its existence alone was enough to unravel reality, to bend the rules of time, space, and consciousness until they fractured. The Watchers were its heralds, scouts sent to prepare the way, to mark those it deemed worthy. James's body was no longer his own. He was a vessel now, a conduit for something far greater. The mark pulsed one final time, and the light exploded outward, engulfing the void in a blinding flash. When James woke, he was lying on the forest floor. The air was still, the world eerily quiet. The twisted trees and pulsing ground were gone, replaced by the familiar sights of the woods he had known his whole life. But something was wrong. The mark on his arm was gone, but he could still feel it, an invisible weight pressing against his skin. The whispers had faded, replaced by a deafening silence that felt even more oppressive. As he stumbled to his feet, he noticed the forest wasn't just quiet, it was lifeless. No birds chirped, no leaves rustled. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. He made his way back to the edge of the forest, his steps unsteady, his mind racing. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare brought on by fear and exhaustion? But as he emerged from the trees, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The world was not the same. The sky above was wrong. The stars shone brighter, their light cold and sterile, like the glow of the monolith. They didn't twinkle or shift. They stared, unblinking as if watching. The horizon was distorted, the colors bleeding together in ways that defied nature. And the silence, oh, the silence, followed him, stretching into every corner of the landscape. James staggered into town, hoping for some semblance of normalcy, but it was deserted. Doors hung ajar, streets lay empty, and a thick, metallic smell lingered in the air. He called out, his voice echoing back at him, but no one answered. The world felt abandoned, as if the light had taken everyone and everything with it. But he wasn't alone. He could feel them. The Watchers, lurking just beyond the veil of reality, their presence a constant pressure at the edge of his awareness. They weren't gone. They were waiting. As James wandered through the empty streets, his mind replayed the entity's words. "Through you, the light will spread." He realized with dawning horror what it meant. He wasn't just a survivor, he was the harbinger. The light had used him to pierce into this reality, and now it was here, slowly unraveling everything it touched. The whispers returned, faint but insistent. James dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the voices grew louder, each one echoing the same terrible truth. It has begun. He looked up at the sky, his vision blurring as the stars seemed to grow larger, closer. They weren't stars at all. They were the eyes of the Watchers, and they were coming. James laughed, a hollow, broken sound that echoed through the empty streets. There was no escaping it, no fighting it. The light was here, and it would consume everything. The last coherent thought that passed through his mind before the light overtook him was a question, one he knew would haunt humanity for the brief time it had left. What do you do when the stars themselves are hungry? If this story left you chilled to the bone, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next horrifying tale. And tell me, do you believe they're watching us right now?